Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we step into Miss Marple's world with the governess who burned her letters, where a fire erased the past but not the truth, and the question lingers, what secret was worth destroying? Are you listening late at night or with your morning tea? Let us know in the comments. And now, pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. The afternoon was unseasonably warm for early September, the kind of golden day that made the lawns of Little Brimley shimmer and the roses linger past their prime. On the vicarage grounds, tables had been laid with neat rows of teacups, sponge cakes dusted with sugar, and the inevitable cucumber sandwiches, their crusts cut with almost military precision. The annual parish fête was in full swing, and villagers milled about in their Sunday best, gossiping and laughing with the ease of people who had known each other's secrets for decades. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a wicker chair beneath the shade of a chestnut tree. She was, as ever, knitting something that might one day become a baby's jacket, or perhaps not, for she rarely seemed to finish her projects. Her sharp blue eyes, however, were not fixed upon her needles. They drifted lightly, almost idly, over the crowd Mrs. Price, Ridley whispering too closely in the ear of the Colonel's wife, young Alice Perkins blushing whenever she passed the curate, and Mr. Topham, who had just returned from London, speaking with unusual animation to the schoolmistress. It was into this tranquil scene that Miss Carter arrived, a woman whose presence always caused a subtle shift of mood. Formerly a governess to several respectable families, she had returned to Little Brimley under circumstances not widely discussed. Her hair, streaked with iron grey, was pulled back in a severe bun, her lips were thin, her manner precise. She carried herself with the quiet authority of one used to discipline, though her eyes, if one looked closely, revealed a flicker of unease. No one had expected her appearance at the fête. She had lived in near seclusion these past months in the small cottage on the edge of the village, her only regular companions, the postman and her cat. Whispers circulated about her abrupt dismissal from her last post, about letters she was said to have destroyed in the fireplace late one night. But in a village like Little Brimley, whispers were as common as blackbirds, and often as meaningless. Still, her arrival drew eyes. Even Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. The fête carried on in its orderly fashion, the raffle for the Women's Institute, the cake judging won, predictably, by Mrs. Bantry, the children's sack race tumbling to a cheerful close. But as the shadows lengthened and the vicar raised his glass to thank all for their contributions, a cry split the air. It was sharp, sudden, unmistakably filled with terror. People turned, teacups clattered. There, just beyond the marquee, beside the row of flower beds, Miss Carter lay sprawled upon the grass. Her face was pale, her body unnaturally still. The bun had come loose, and her silver-streaked hair fanned out upon the earth like a fallen crown. The fête dissolved into chaos. Ladies shrieked, the Colonel shouted for order, and the vicar stumbled forward in dismay. Dr. Graham pushed through the gathering crowd, bent over her, and then looked up, his expression grave. "She's dead," he said simply. And though no one could yet say how, Miss Marple, sitting very still beneath her chestnut tree, felt the old, familiar certainty settle upon her. There was something more than a sudden illness or tragic accident. The governess had carried secrets with her, and secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a way of leaving traces behind. The vicarage grounds, only moments before so filled with the laughter of children and the clinking of teacups, now simmered with an uneasy hush, broken only by hurried whispers. Miss Carter's body had been carried into the cool shade of the vestry, while Dr. Graham awaited a constable from St. Mary Mead. The fête was abruptly abandoned, the raffle forgotten, the sponge cakes left untouched. Yet even in shock, Little Brimley's villagers could not resist doing what they did best, talking. By the following morning, every household in the village had heard the news in 3 different versions, none entirely accurate. Some said she had clutched her throat and gasped before falling. Others insisted she had been struck by a blow, though no mark had been found. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had seen a glass in Miss Carter's hand poison, no doubt, and self-administered, while old Mr. Cottrell swore blind he had glimpsed a shadow moving quickly away from the flower beds just as the cry was heard. Miss Marple, sitting at her breakfast table with a slice of toast and honey, read her newspaper without really taking in the words. She had long ago learned that the truth of such matters was rarely in the dramatic pronouncements of villagers, but in the tiny inconsistencies, the overlooked habits, the subtleties of human nature. She thought of Miss Carter's solitary figure at the fête, the way she had kept apart, her eyes flickering nervously whenever someone greeted her. Fear, that was what Jane Marple had seen beneath the governess's controlled exterior. At the grocer's that morning, speculation ran wild. Mrs. Bantry, flushed with self-importance, held court beside the biscuit tins. "Mark my words, it was her past that caught up with her," she said, adjusting her hat. "One doesn't burn letters in the dead of night unless there's something worth hiding. You all remember the smoke from her chimney in March, do you not? Papers, everyone said. Papers, and quite possibly incriminating ones." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. I never liked her manner. Too stiff. Always made one feel as though one were being corrected in one's grammar. A governess through and through, those sort of women see everything and forgive nothing. "Still," said the vicar's wife gently, "it's tragic. Poor soul. Alone in that cottage with no family. Whatever she had done or not done seems cruel that she should meet her end at our fête." But sympathy was a rare currency in Little Brimley. By midday, theories had multiplied: a jilted lover from years past, a blackmailer silenced, or some dreadful scandal in her previous employment. The women whispered eagerly, while the men adopted grave expressions and muttered about a bad business and a job for the police. Inspector Craddock arrived that afternoon from St. Mary Mead, a man of methodical habits and square jaw. He had worked with Miss Marple once before and held a cautious respect for her unobtrusive insights. He took statements, scribbling neatly in his notebook, and ordered the post-mortem. No outward wound, no sign of struggle, yet death had been sudden and final. Meanwhile, Miss Marple walked quietly through the village, knitting a bag on her arm, stopping here and there for a word with neighbors. She never asked directly, that was not her way. Instead, she listened. To the laundress complaining that Miss Carter never entrusted her with more than a handful of garments. To the postman recalling how she signed for her letters with a trembling hand. To young Alice Perkins, who whispered that she had once seen Miss Carter standing at her window, staring across the green with an expression of such sorrow that it had frightened her. By evening, Miss Marple sat again by her hearth, needles clicking gently. She thought of governesses she had known, women in precarious positions, neither servant nor family, often privy to secrets but powerless to act upon them. Such a role bred enemies easily. If Miss Carter had been dismissed suddenly, if she had burned letters, it suggested knowledge of something dangerous, something others wished silenced. The village gossips, eager though they were, circled round only the obvious. Poison in the teacup, a fainting fit, some nameless scandal. Miss Marple, however, knew that truth was rarely so straightforward. Human nature, she reminded herself, is curiously alike in every place, whether in Little Brimley or London society. Someone, somewhere, had feared Miss Carter's presence. Someone had looked upon the governess not as a solitary woman to be pitied, but as a threat to be removed. The next day's paper announced in a small column, "Sudden death at parish fete. Investigation pending." The words seemed almost trivial against the quiet enormity of it for those who had known her. At the vicarage, the Women's Institute convened to decide whether to continue with their autumn fair. It would seem heartless not to, Mrs. Bantry opined, though her eyes gleamed with the excitement of scandal. Others murmured their agreement, for routine was the strongest balm to shock in village life. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, baking, gardening, letters posted at the usual hour, lay a thread of unease. The governess had been one of them, however distant, and her death was a reminder that dark things could intrude even upon their tidy world. Miss Marple placed her knitting in her lap and gazed thoughtfully into the fire. In her experience, truth always left a trail. A careless word, an unexpected look, a detail others dismissed as unimportant. Already she felt the faint tug of threads waiting to be drawn together. And she, Jane Marple, with her lifetime of observation, intended to see where they led. The village, meanwhile, buzzed on. Behind lace curtains, in whispered conversations at the shop, on the church steps after evensong, theories were traded like currency. Yet in all that noise, the one person who had said least was Miss Marple herself. She listened, she observed, she remembered, for she knew that among all the chatter, the truth was waiting quiet, hidden, but inevitable. And soon enough, the first suspect would emerge. Inspector Craddock returned to Little Brimley the next morning, his presence lending a sense of authority to the uncertainty that had settled over the village. He was a square, competent man, not given to speculation, preferring hard facts, statements, and timelines. Yet he could not ignore the air of whispered theories that met him at every doorstep. In villages such as these, rumor moved quicker than evidence, and more often than not, it blurred the line between truth and fancy. The post-mortem had revealed little beyond the obvious. Miss Carter had not died of natural causes. There were no signs of heart failure, stroke, or seizure. Instead, the doctor had found traces of something foreign in her stomach enough, he confirmed grimly, to bring on swift death. It was poison, though precisely what kind remained to be determined. Craddock sat with the vicar in the study, papers neatly arranged before him. No wounds, no struggle. If poison, then it was ingested almost certainly, and something she consumed at the fete. "Tell me, did she eat or drink anything unusual?" The vicar frowned. "Not to my knowledge. She took a glass of lemonade, I recall seeing it in her hand. But so did half the parish. That was the difficulty at a fete, where cups were exchanged, plates passed round, and everyone nibbled at trifles and sponge cakes. How could one isolate a single source?" Craddock made a note regardless. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had spent the morning strolling along the village green, stopping here and there with her knitting bag, her demeanor calm and benign. She paused by the shop, where Mrs. Bantry held forth to a small audience, repeating for perhaps the 5th time her suspicion that Miss Carter had taken her own life. "I'm certain of it," Mrs. Bantry declared, tapping her parasol. A woman of her solitary habits, no friends, no family, secrets hanging over her. It would not surprise me if she had slipped something into her drink herself. Miss Marple murmured. Something mild about the unlikelihood of one bringing poison to a parish fete for such a purpose, and allowed the conversation to drift away from her. She noted, however, the way young Alice Perkins lingered near the edge of the group, pale and silent. A sensitive girl, Alice often overheard more than she let on. Later that day, Miss Marple was visited by Inspector Craddock, who, though not one to indulge in gossip, was wise enough to seek her impressions. They sat in her neat sitting room, the canary singing faintly in its cage, while she poured him tea. "It was very sudden," she said thoughtfully, "and though many will call it suicide, I cannot help but recall Miss Carter's face that afternoon. There was fear there, Inspector. Fear and watchfulness. A woman does not watch so closely if she intends to remove herself from life. No, I believe she expected something." Craddock looked at her keenly. "Expected? You think she was threatened?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, not necessarily with words, but one can be threatened by the very presence of another. It is curious how often people in villages reveal themselves in what they choose not to say." Craddock made no comment, though he jotted a note in his small, tidy script. That evening, he conducted interviews at the vicarage, calling in those who had been nearest to the scene. Dr. Graham spoke of the symptoms of sudden collapse, pallor, shallow breathing. Mrs. Price Ridley, predictably, emphasized the glass of lemonade. Colonel Hartley swore that he had seen Miss Carter in conversation with the schoolmistress only minutes before. When Miss Dawes, the schoolmistress in question, entered, her manner was brisk, though her hands trembled as she adjusted her spectacles. "She merely asked after a former pupil of mine," Miss Dawes explained. "Nothing unusual. She was often curious about children she had once instructed." "Curious in what way?" Craddock pressed. Miss Dawes hesitated. She inquired particularly whether one girl was still living in the village. "I found it strange as the family moved away some years ago." It was a curious detail, and Miss Marple, who had been quietly permitted to sit at the edge of the room, took it in with her usual mild expression. To most, it might seem irrelevant to her. It suggested threads stretching backward into the life Miss Carter had before her return to Little Brimley. The next morning, the village was abuzz again. At the post office, Mrs. Bantry was overheard insisting that Miss Carter had once been engaged to a man who later married another woman. At the baker's, it was whispered she had been dismissed from her last position for knowing too much about her employer. And outside the church, old Mr. Cottrell repeated that he had seen a figure moving away from the flower beds at the very moment of the cry, though when pressed, he admitted he could not say whether it was a man or a woman. Inspector Craddock compiled his notes, weighing the statements. Suicide was unlikely poison, suggested deliberate intent. Yet, who had the opportunity? Who had a motive? The fate had been bustling, cups and plates passing from hand to hand. Too many chances, too many possibilities. Still, one detail struck him: the burned letters. Several villagers had spoken of them, and he was determined to know more. That evening, Miss Marple reflected as she sat by her fire. Letters burned in haste, a solitary woman fearful, inquiries about a former pupil, all these were small, separate pieces. She thought of the patterns she had observed over her long years. Governesses, dismissed suddenly, often bore the weight of knowing something others wished hidden. And if Miss Carter had been silenced, it was because someone feared what she might yet reveal. Outside, the village lay hushed in its twilight routine, lamps glowing in cottage windows, smoke rising from chimneys. Yet beneath that familiar calm, tension stretched thin as thread. Somewhere in Little Brimley, Miss Marple knew, lay the hand that had prepared a quiet cup of death. And soon, as gossip gave way to suspicion, the first name would be spoken aloud, not in whispers, but in accusation. By the third day after the fete, the villagers had done what they always did in times of uncertainty and settled, quite firmly, upon a suspect. The honor of being first to point the finger belonged, predictably, to Mrs. Price Ridley. She was overheard at the milliner's, declaring that there had been bad blood between Miss Carter and Miss Dawes, the schoolmistress. She was sharp with her, Mrs. Price Ridley insisted, voice lowered just enough to suggest confidence, though half the shop could hear her. "I saw it myself." Miss Carter asking her questions in that cold way of hers, and Miss Dawes went red as a beetroot. They say governesses and school teachers never do get along. Professional jealousy, you know. Mark my words, if anyone slipped something into that lemonade, it was Miss Dawes. By tea-time, the rumor had gained substance. The schoolmistress's name was being spoken with grave shakes of the head, her character examined and dissected as only a small village could do. She was too strict. Some said she kept to herself too much. She had once been overlooked for a post at a larger school. It all sounded damning in the mouths of the gossiping villagers, though none of it amounted to evidence. Inspector Craddock, however, could not ignore the mounting pressure. He called Miss Dawes to the vicarage for further questioning. She arrived brisk and upright, though her lips trembled slightly as she removed her gloves. "I have nothing to hide," she said firmly. "Yes, Miss Carter asked me about a girl I once taught. Why should she not? It was idle curiosity. As for this nonsense about poison, had nothing to do with her death. I scarcely knew the woman. Craddock regarded her with his steady eyes. You were the last to speak with her before she collapsed. Several witnesses confirm it. That proves nothing, Miss Dawes retorted, her voice cracking. I only answered her question. If you choose to see more in it, I cannot help you. When she left, she walked with her head high, though those who watched from the lane noticed her hands shaking as she fumbled to fasten her cloak. In the village, her composure was taken as guilt. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained silent. She had known many women like Miss Dawes, lonely, precise, and fearful of ridicule. Such women often became scapegoats because their manner was less agreeable than others. To accuse the schoolmistress seemed far too convenient. At the grocer's, Miss Marple listened to the speculation with her usual mild smile. They always say it is the one who looks most awkward, she remarked gently. But awkwardness, in my experience, is often nothing more than self-consciousness. People are so easily misunderstood, don't you think? The grocer's assistant, a lad with more curiosity than sense, leaned across the counter. They do say, miss, that Miss Dawes once lost her post in another village. A bad business it was. Maybe there's more to her than meets the eye. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, and moved on, her mind already turning to another point. For she had been thinking of Mr. Cottrell's insistence that he had seen a shadow moving away from the flower beds at the moment of the cry. It was not Miss Dawes he had described, nor any one of her slight figure. If anything, he had suggested a taller, heavier build. Such details, easily overlooked, mattered greatly to Miss Marple. That evening, Inspector Craddock again sought her company, partly for advice, partly for the comfort of her calm presence. They sat by her fire, the clock ticking softly between them. "It is Dawes, I think," Craddock said after a pause. "The woman is nervous, evasive, and she had the opportunity." But he frowned. "I can't help feeling it's too neat, almost as if the village decided for me." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Yes, Inspector, that is the danger of villages. They like their dramas to be clear and tidy. A wicked governess, a jealous schoolmistress. It fits the story so well that no one troubles to question it. But real wickedness, you know, is seldom so obliging." Craddock gave her a wry look. "And what do you think?" "Oh, I think human nature is very much the same everywhere," she replied. "The motives may vary, but the patterns rarely do. I would like to know more about those letters she burned. Letters are dangerous things, particularly when destroyed in haste." The next day brought fresh fuel to the fire. A charwoman who had occasionally worked at Miss Carter's cottage told anyone who would listen that she had once seen a locked tin box beneath the governess's bed. "She was that secretive about it," the woman whispered. "Never let me dust near it." And then one day it was gone, vanished like... I'll wager it had something to do with her death. Whispers of the missing box soon entwined with the suspicions against Miss Dawes. If there had been letters, if there had been secrets, then surely someone had cause to silence Miss Carter. And who better than the last woman seen speaking to her? By dusk, the case seemed all but decided in the eyes of little Brimley. The schoolmistress was guilty, the governess's past was buried with her. Only Miss Marple, knitting by her window, kept her thoughts to herself. She had seen the look on Miss Dawes's face, the mixture of pride and desperation. That was not the face of a murderess, it was the face of a woman terrified of being judged for something far smaller than poison and death. And so, while the village settled comfortably upon its chosen culprit, Miss Marple turned her mind to other possibilities. For if Miss Dawes was not the killer, then the true hand still moved, hidden behind the curtains of little Brimley. And such a hand, she knew, would not stay idle for long. The morning after the village had all but condemned Miss Dawes, the air in little Brimley seemed deceptively tranquil. Children hurried to school, tradesmen called their wares, and the postman made his rounds. Yet beneath the surface of daily routine, the unease lingered. People lowered their voices when Miss Dawes passed by, and more than one curtain twitched as she walked down the lane, her back stiff, her gaze straight ahead. Miss Marple, however, was not among those content with the simple explanation. She had, over the course of many years, learned that the most obvious suspect was very seldom the true culprit. Appearances could deceive, and human nature had a knack for concealing its darker impulses behind the banal. It was during one of her customary visits to the vicarage that she came upon the detail which caught her attention. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's gentle wife, was sorting through the leftover crockery from the fete. Dozens of cups and saucers had been gathered for washing and returning to their owners, and Miss Marple, who had offered to assist, found herself drying the last few. "How extraordinary," Mrs. Clement remarked, holding up a chipped teacup. "This one doesn't belong to anyone I know, not from the Women's Institute set, nor from the church cupboards." Miss Marple took the cup from her, turning it over in her hands. It was plain white china, unmarked by any distinctive pattern, but along the rim was a faint yellowish residue, clinging stubbornly despite repeated washing. It was not lemon, of that she was certain. The smell was faintly chemical, unpleasant. She placed it carefully on the sideboard. "Perhaps it came in with the general jumble," she suggested mildly. "But I should think it might be wise not to discard it just yet." Later that afternoon, she walked to the chemist's, ostensibly to purchase a new skein of wool. While the shop was quiet, she asked, with her usual air of innocent curiosity, about certain powders. "For cleaning, you know," she said, her tone casual. "One sometimes hears of strong substances. Quite dreadful if swallowed by mistake, I imagine." The chemist, eager to display his knowledge, described several compounds kept in locked cabinets, strychnine, arsenic, and certain preparations for vermin. "All deadly," he assured her, though rarely requested. Miss Marple nodded, thanked him, and left with her wool. She had not, of course, asked about the exact residue she had seen, but she had a growing suspicion. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock was pressing ahead with his inquiries. The missing tin box troubled him, so too did the burned letters. He had made discreet inquiries about Miss Carter's last position, but the responses were guarded. She had served in the household of a wealthy family, the Fletchers, but her employment had ended suddenly, without reference. Such dismissals rarely occurred without cause. Miss Marple, hearing this through the vicar, tucked the information away with quiet satisfaction. A governess privy to family affairs might easily learn things best kept hidden: disgrace, scandal, impropriety. Letters could confirm such things. Letters burned might mean someone feared exposure. Yet it was the teacup that preoccupied her most. It was small, unassuming, but she knew well enough that great crimes often turned on such trifles. Many a murder had been solved not through grand revelations, but through a detail overlooked by those too busy searching for larger clues. That evening, she sat in her chair by the hearth, the cup now safely wrapped in paper in her knitting bag. The fire crackled, her needles clicked, and her thoughts wandered through the possibilities. If Miss Carter's death had come by poison, then that cup, unfamiliar and out of place, might have been the vessel. Someone had taken care to use it, perhaps even to place it among the jumble afterward. It was clumsy work, yet clumsy work often came from desperation. At the same time, Miss Marple could not ignore the deeper puzzle. Why Miss Carter? Why now? She had lived in her cottage for nearly a year, withdrawn but harmless. Why had her presence suddenly become intolerable to someone? The answer, she suspected, lay in the past hinted at by burned letters, a missing tin box, and inquiries about a former pupil. News of the unfamiliar cup reached Inspector Craddock by the next day, thanks to Mrs. Clement's honesty. He examined it gravely, sniffing the faint residue, and ordered it sent for analysis. Inwardly, He cursed the muddle of borrowed crockery and exchanged cups, which had rendered the fate a nightmare of uncertainty. Yet he had to admit the possibility was clear. The poison might have been administered not in food, but in a single cup, chosen for one victim alone. When he shared this with Miss Marple, she merely nodded, her eyes serene. Yes, Inspector. People do not usually plan for large occasions. They act within the means available. If one desired to give a certain person a fatal drink, one would take care they had the right cup. A simple method, really, but effective. Craddock gave her a sharp look. You make it sound almost commonplace. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, not commonplace, Inspector, but very much in keeping with human nature. People often think themselves cleverer than they are. In fact, they rely on others failing to notice. That cup was meant to pass unseen. As she spoke, she thought again of Miss Carter's expression that day at the fete, watchful, wary, as though she knew danger hovered nearby. Perhaps she had guessed her end was coming, though not from which direction it would strike. And so, with the teacup now added to the puzzle, Miss Marple knitted on, her mind turning over the strands of gossip, the fragments of fact, and the curious persistence of human folly. She knew the picture was far from complete, but one thing was certain. Miss Dawes, convenient scapegoat though she was, did not fit the pattern. The truth lay elsewhere, hidden still. The village, however, was restless. They had chosen their culprit, and now a new clue unsettled them. If the schoolmistress was not guilty, then who was? For in Little Brimley, suspicion, once lost, did not easily return to its cage. It would shift, it would grow, it would spread, and before long, fresh secrets would begin to stir into the open. The discovery of the unfamiliar teacup had unsettled Little Brimley more than any official pronouncement could have done. Its quiet presence at the vicarage, waiting to be analyzed, seemed to whisper of something deliberate and cruel. Rumors shifted like autumn mist. Miss Dawes's name, once the favorite of the gossips, began to lose its sharpness as other possibilities crept in. If not the schoolmistress, then who? It was Mrs. Bantry, of course, who first suggested that Dr. Graham might know more than he admitted. Doctors have access to all sorts of dreadful substances, she said in her most authoritative tone at the Women's Institute meeting. And if poor Miss Carter consulted him well, he might have given her something without realizing how strong it was, or perhaps someone slipped it from his dispensary. The thought was scandalous, but it was not dismissed. For Dr. Graham, though respected, was a bachelor of middle years who kept largely to himself. People remembered now that Miss Carter had once visited his surgery, though for what ailment no one could say. When confronted with this speculation by Inspector Craddock, Dr. Graham's temper flared. Utter nonsense, he snapped. Yes, she came to me. She complained of nerves, sleeplessness. I gave her a mild tonic, nothing harmful. If anyone says otherwise, they're liars. But poison was used, Craddock reminded him, and some poisons can be derived from common medicines. The doctor's face hardened. Then you had better look elsewhere, Inspector. I locked my cabinet, as always. Only a thief or a fool could have gained access. Meanwhile, other whispers began to circle about Mr. Topham, the recently returned gentleman from London. He'd been seen speaking with Miss Carter at the fete, more animatedly than one might expect for two people of no close acquaintance. Alice Perkins, eager to be noticed, claimed she had overheard a fragment of their conversation. She said something about knowing the truth, Alice whispered to her friend, who repeated it eagerly to three others before supper. By the following morning it was common knowledge that Miss Carter had threatened Mr. Topham with some dreadful revelation. His recent return from London, his vague stories of business, and his somewhat strained finances all combined to make him a figure of interest. Confronted with this rumor, Mr. Topham laughed it off. Pure fancy, he told the inspector, though his smile was tight. I scarcely knew the woman. She was eccentric, always prying into things that did not concern her. If she thought to unearth some scandal about me, she was mistaken. But his defensiveness did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple, observing these developments, remained her quiet self, offering no accusations. She was content to let the villagers' tongues wag, for she knew that in the course of gossip, truths often slipped out unawares. She recalled Alice Perkins's claim about overhearing the words, knowing the truth. It was vague, yes, but suggestive. Miss Carter had been holding something over perhaps more than one person. Later that week, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Price Ridley under the pretext of delivering some knitting for the church bazaar. The formidable lady welcomed her in, eager to discuss the case. In her parlour, scented heavily of lavender, she lowered her voice to confide, "I've always said Miss Carter was a dangerous sort. She knew too much about people's affairs. Why, only last winter she hinted that certain respectable folk might not be as respectable as they seemed." "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, her needles moving. "And did she mention anyone in particular?" Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. She said nothing outright, of course, but her tone implied volumes. I wondered at the time if she meant Mrs. Bantry, you know. There was that curious business with her nephew, gambling debts in London and hush-hush arrangements made. Oh yes, governments are observant creatures. Too observant. Miss Marple listened, smiling gently, but her thoughts ranged wider. She had heard too many stories of governesses carrying unspoken knowledge of family indiscretions, illegitimate births, hidden debts, unsuitable romances. Such knowledge, in the wrong hands, became power, and power was dangerous. That evening, Inspector Craddock compiled his notes with growing frustration. Dr. Graham, Mr. Topham, even Mrs. Bantry's family connections all presented motives of a sort, yet nothing concrete. He turned at last to Miss Marple. "You've heard more than I have," he said ruefully. "What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Only that dear Miss Carter seems to have been rather too well informed about her neighbours. A pity, really. People seldom thank those who know their secrets. I remember a case in St. Mary Meadow many years ago when a poor girl discovered her mistress's indiscretions. It did not end happily. You see, Inspector, human nature resents being known too clearly." Craddock leaned back, sighing. So she had enough enemies. But which one? And where's the proof? Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Proof, Inspector, is often a matter of behaviour. People betray themselves long before they are found out. One must simply watch." And watch she did. At church the following Sunday, she noted how Mr. Topham avoided the gaze of the congregation, how Dr. Graham sang too loudly as though to assert his innocence, and how Miss Dawes sat rigid, ignored by her neighbours. Yet most telling of all was Mrs. Bantry, whose chatter seemed louder than ever, spilling into places it need not go. It was as if the whole village had been shaken, and each person, in their own way, betrayed unease. Miss Marple, quiet in her pew, considered the threads weaving together the missing box, the burned letters, the unfamiliar teacup, and the governess's watchful fear. Somewhere among these, the truth waited, pressing gently against the surface. And she suspected, with her unerring instinct, that the surface was about to crack, for secrets, once stirred, seldom remained buried long. In Little Brimley, the time was coming when confrontation would no longer be delayed. The following week dawned with a chill in the air, autumn stealing quietly into Little Brimley. Yet the cool mornings did little to settle the village nerves. The investigation into Miss Carter's death had produced much talk but few results, and the longer the case lingered unresolved, the more restless the villagers became. Then, quite suddenly, something occurred that unsettled everyone afresh. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Mrs. Bantry, who had been holding her customary card party, excused herself to fetch more sherry from the sideboard. As she lifted the decanter, she gave a sharp cry, dropped the stopper, and staggered back. Her lips had gone white, her hand trembled violently. Within moments, she collapsed into a chair, her breath shallow and uneven. The room dissolved into chaos. Colonel Hartley rang for the maid. Mrs. Price Ridley fanned her ineffectually, and Dr. Graham, who was present, hurried to her side. After examining her, he frowned deeply. "She has been poisoned," he declared, "but mercifully, not fatally. The dose was too small or too hastily prepared. She'll recover." The words swept through the room like fire. Poison again. Within minutes, the entire village was buzzing. Someone had attempted to kill Mrs. Bantry. The constable was summoned, then Inspector Craddock himself. He questioned everyone present, but the facts were maddeningly vague. The decanter of sherry had been standing on the sideboard all evening, and several had drunk from it with no ill effect. Only Mrs. Bantry's glass had borne the bitter taste. When Miss Marple heard the news the next morning, she felt no surprise. Sitting at her window, her knitting needles motionless in her lap, she thought carefully. This second incident was clumsy, desperate. It spoke not of calculation, but of fear that something was slipping out of control. At the vicarage later that day, Inspector Craddock voiced the same frustration. First Miss Carter, now Mrs. Bantry. If the same hand is behind both, then they're reckless indeed. Poisoning at a fete, then at a card party it's too public, too messy. What kind of murderer behaves like this? Miss Marple gave him a mild smile. "One who is afraid, Inspector. You see, fear makes people careless. It is a dreadful motivator, but very common. One thinks only of removing the threat, never of how one appears in the doing." Craddock shook his head. "But why Mrs. Bantry? She's no governess with secrets to burn." "Oh, but she does chatter," Miss Marple reminded him gently. "She has a way of repeating things she ought not. Perhaps she knew something without realizing its importance. Or perhaps she was simply in the way." That evening, Mrs. Bantry, pale but recovering, entertained a stream of sympathetic callers. To each, she told the story of her sudden illness, embellishing it with a dramatic flair. "I assure you, I tasted something strange at once," she declared, hand fluttering at her throat. "Like almonds, though faint. I said to myself, 'My dear Dolly, this is the end.'" Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner, caught the phrase "like almonds" and tucked it away. Almonds often meant cyanide, though whether Mrs. Bantry truly knew the taste or merely repeated a tale she had heard, it was difficult to say. Outside, the gossip grew louder. Suspicion, once focused on Miss Dawes, now swung toward Dr. Graham. "He was right there," Mrs. Price Ridley said triumphantly. "If anyone could manage poison under our very noses, it's him. A man of medicine knows all the tricks." Others murmured about Mr. Topham, pointing out that he had excused himself briefly from the card table that evening. Theories flourished, each wilder than the last, and by dusk Little Brimley was alive with speculation. Miss Marple, however, thought of the governess again. Miss Carter had died quietly, swiftly, by poison. Mrs. Bantry had nearly followed. The connection was not obvious, yet Miss Marple felt certain it was there. The difference lay in intent. One had been silenced with finality, the other merely frightened or warned. That night she recalled a case from years ago, when a servant girl had been given a threatening dose of poison not to kill, but to remind her of her silence. Fear, after all, could be a weapon as sharp as death. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bantry again, bringing a posy of late roses. As they sat together, she asked with apparent innocence, "Tell me, dear, had you been speaking much of Miss Carter before your card party? You know how people sometimes say more than they realize." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. Why, I had, come to think of it. I was telling Colonel Hartley about the curious story of her burning letters. I said it must have been something quite dreadful to make a woman act like that. And then, well, you know what happened. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Yes, it fitted. The second attempt had not been intended to kill, but to silence chatter. Someone feared that too much talk of letters, of secrets, might draw unwelcome light upon them. And so the pattern grew clearer. The governess had known something tied to her years of service and her destroyed correspondence. Someone in Little Brimley feared exposure, feared gossip, and now struck blindly at those who stirred the embers. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She moved slowly, as though nothing troubled her, but in her mind the pieces were shifting, aligning. A governess's secrets, a missing box, an unfamiliar cup, and now a frightened attempt to silence another tongue. It was all too much to be a coincidence, and she knew, though she did not yet say, that the next move would not be made out of calculation, but desperation. For the murderer was losing control. The attempted poisoning of Mrs. Bantry changed the atmosphere in Little Brimley entirely. Where before there had been whispers and sly glances, now there was open fear. People locked their larders, eyed their teacups suspiciously, and wondered who among them might be plotting death at the village's very hearth. Inspector Craddock did what he could to calm matters, but his inquiries led him in circles. Each suspect seemed plausible on one day and implausible the next. Dr. Graham bristled at the continued insinuations. Mr. Topham grew short-tempered, insisting he was being persecuted by gossip. Even Mrs. Bantry, though loudly proclaiming herself a victim, added fuel to the fire with each retelling of her tale. Miss Marple, however, appeared unruffled. She continued her quiet rounds through the village, stopping for a word here, a chat there, her eyes sharp behind their mildness. She knew the time had come to test those she suspected, though never directly. A direct accusation would only harden defenses. Far better to let a careless word, a flicker of the eyes, or a nervous gesture betray the truth. Her first visit was to Dr. Graham. She carried with her a jar of plum preserves, as though on an ordinary errand. "My niece sent me these," she explained, setting the jar on his kitchen table. "But I wondered, Doctor, do you think such preserves keep well? One hears dreadful stories of contamination, poisoning even." The doctor gave a startled laugh, though it rang a little hollow. "My dear Miss Marple, you mustn't believe every tale you hear. Poisoning from jam, indeed. Leave such fears to the villagers' imaginations." "Still," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes never leaving his, "one cannot be too careful. I've always thought it rather unfair that doctors must keep so many dangerous substances in their homes. It must weigh heavily, don't you think? The responsibility." For a moment, Dr. Graham's jaw tightened. Then he smiled again. "I'm quite used to it, I assure you. And I guard my cabinet well. You needn't look in my direction for your murderer." Miss Marple made no denial, only thanked him sweetly and took her leave. But she noted the way he had gripped the back of his chair as though steadying himself. Her next call was upon Mr. Topham. She found him in his garden, trimming hedges with unnecessary vigor. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said brightly. "What a fine job you're doing. I always say, neat hedges reflect neat minds." Mr. Topham muttered something about keeping busy. Miss Marple continued as though idly, "I suppose you must find Little Brimley very dull after London. Though it is curious, is it not, how the past follows one wherever one goes? I have often noticed that people imagine they can begin afresh in a new place, only to find that secrets have a way of catching up with them." The shears paused mid-snip. Mr. Topham turned sharply. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild as cream. "Only an observation. Human nature, you know it repeats itself. Governesses, for example, are forever stumbling on things not meant for their ears. I dare say Miss Carter was no exception. Mr. Topham's face paled beneath his sunburn. He muttered something about meddling women and bent back to his hedge, cutting furiously. Miss Marple watched a moment longer, then bade him good day, her eyes twinkling as she walked away. On the third day, she visited Miss Dawes, the schoolmistress. Poor Miss Dawes had withdrawn almost entirely from the village, enduring cold looks and whispered remarks. When Miss Marple entered her small cottage, she found the woman pale and strained, her books neatly stacked as though for comfort. "I came to bring you some wool," Miss Marple said kindly. "A little knitting is a great solace when the world feels unfriendly." Miss Dawes blinked back tears. "They all think I killed her," she whispered. "But I swear I did not. She frightened me. Yes, her questions, but I had no wish for her death." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Of course not, my dear. People are often cruel when frightened. They choose an easy target, and a solitary woman makes the easiest of all. But take heart. Truth has a way of showing itself, given time." As she left, Miss Marple considered what she had seen. Miss Dawes's terror was real, but not the terror of guilt. Rather, it was the terror of being wrongly judged, of having no defense in a village eager for villains. That evening, in her quiet sitting room, Miss Marple began to weave together the threads. Dr. Graham's unease, Mr. Topham's defensiveness, Miss Dawes's desperation, each reaction told her more than words could. And above it all, the spectre of Miss Carter loomed, the solitary governess, burdened with knowledge, burning her letters in the dead of night, fearful until the last moment. Inspector Craddock called again, looking worn. "I'm at my wit's end," he admitted. "I have 3 suspects and no evidence, and now this business with Mrs. Bantry complicates matters further. If I could only be sure of one thing, what exactly did Miss Carter know?" Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully, her knitting needles still. "That, Inspector, is indeed the key. But I think the answer is already here, among us. One must only look closely at what people reveal when they believe they are safe. A word spoken too sharply, a fear disguised as anger, those are the true clues. Not fingerprints or footprints, but human frailty." Craddock gave her a weary smile. "And you mean to find it, of course." Miss Marple's expression was serene. "One must be patient, Inspector. I've set my little tests, and soon enough someone will betray themselves. The truth, like cream, always rises to the top." As the fire crackled in her hearth, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind sharper than her needles. The game was drawing to its close. One more push, one more slip, and the murderer would stand revealed. But until then, she waited quiet, unassuming and watchful, as only Jane Marple could be. The village hall was unusually full that Thursday evening. Inspector Craddock had chosen it as the place to gather the principal figures connected with the case, for the gossip in Little Brimley had reached such a pitch that something had to be done. Better, he reasoned, to address the matter openly than allow suspicion to fester unchecked in every cottage. Miss Marple was there, seated quietly in a corner, her knitting bag at her side. She had been the one to suggest such a gathering, though in her delicate way she never pressed, merely hinted that it might bring clarity. Craddock, weary of half-truths and nervous denials, had agreed. Around the long table sat Dr. Graham, stiff-backed and irritable, Mr. Topham, his mouth set in a hard line. Miss Dawes, pale and trembling Mrs. Bantry, still milking her role as victim, and Mrs. Price Ridley, positively glowing with the self-importance of an invited witness. Inspector Craddock began with the facts. Miss Carter died at the fete, poisoned. A teacup not belonging to any of the usual sets bore traces of a harmful substance. Days later, Mrs. Bantry nearly suffered the same fate again by poison. I believe both incidents are connected, and that the same hand is responsible. Tonight, I ask each of you again, what connection did you have with Miss Carter? And what reason might anyone have to wish her dead? There was silence, then a flutter of voices as each sought to defend themselves. Dr. Graham insisted he had prescribed only harmless tonics. Mr. Topham declared his innocence yet again. Miss Dawes protested that she had nothing to hide, though her hands twisted together on the table. It was Miss Marple who broke the rising din, her voice mild but carrying. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we might save time if I put forward what I believe happened. It may be quite wrong, of course. I'm an old woman, easily muddled. Still, sometimes a muddled thought has a grain of truth." All eyes turned to her, some with exasperation, others with relief. Craddock gave a small nod, his expression betraying trust. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Miss Carter was a governess, and governesses, by the nature of their work, live half inside families and half outside them. They see everything, and though they may not speak, they notice. Our poor Miss Carter noticed far more than was good for her. She carried knowledge dangerously to someone here in Little Brimley. Mr. Topham gave a sharp laugh. "Are we to believe this nonsense?" The woman was a lonely spinster with nothing but old books for company. Miss Marple smiled at him. But she was not always so. She worked for the Fletchers, did she not? A respectable family, but one with a scandal or two. And she carried away with her certain letters she later burned. Why burn them unless they contained truths that might harm another? There was a stir at the table. Miss Dawes looked bewildered, Dr. Graham frowned, but Mr. Topham shifted uneasily in his chair. She inquired about a former pupil, Miss Marple. That was the thread which began to unravel the whole. She had come across some connection between that girl and someone here. She thought to probe further. And she made a mistake, a governess's mistake. She revealed too much of her knowledge before she was safe. Someone realized she could expose them and acted swiftly. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. Then it was the doctor, surely. He has the poisons. But Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, my dear. Doctors are too obvious. Besides, Dr. Graham's manner is that of a man wrongfully suspected, not guilty. No, the cup tells us more than he ever could. That cup, brought from outside, did not belong to any institute or church set. It was smuggled in for one purpose alone, to ensure Miss Carter, and only Miss Carter received her fatal draught." Her gaze rested on Mr. Topham. "You see, Mr. Topham, it was you who returned from London with secrets of your own. Your business affairs there were in disarray, your debts significant. Miss Carter knew something of it, perhaps through her former employers, perhaps through a letter she once kept. She confronted you at the fete, did she not? And you, in your panic, sought to silence her." Mr. Topham's face darkened. "That's absurd. I spoke with her, yes, but only politely. You can't prove Miss Marple's voice?" Still calm, cut across his protest. "But then Mrs. Bantry spoke too freely of letters, of secrets at her card party. And once again, you panicked. You attempted to poison her as well. Fortunately for her, your hand was less steady. Your preparation rushed. She survived. But your fear betrayed you, Mr. Topham. Fear always does." There was a hush, broken only by Mrs. Price Ridley's scandalized gasp. Craddock leaned forward. "Well, Topham, do you have anything to say?" Mr. Topham's eyes darted around the room. His lips parted as if to form a denial, then closed again. At last, he slumped back in his chair. "She would have ruined me," he muttered hoarsely. "She knew too much. Always prying, always watching. I couldn't let her destroy everything." I thought his voice cracked. I thought it would be simple. Miss Dawes gave a sob of relief, while Dr. Graham folded his arms with grim satisfaction. Mrs. Bantry looked more triumphant than shaken, as though surviving an attempt on her life elevated her to some dramatic importance. Miss Marple, however, only sighed softly. "So tragic," she said. "Poor Miss Carter. She was not an unkind woman, only lonely. Her knowledge frightened others, but perhaps she kept it less maliciously than they believed. And now her silence is complete. Craddock rose, signalling to the constable to take Mr. Topham away. Yet even as the village exhaled in relief, Miss Marple's face remained thoughtful. She knew well that evil seldom appeared in the form of villains twirling mustaches. It lived in fear, in weakness, in the desperate desire to protect oneself at any cost. And little Brimley, for all its tidy lanes and lace curtains, was no different from anywhere else. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was always the same. The days following Mr. Topham's arrest passed with a peculiar blend of relief and unease. The air in Little Brimley, so long thick with suspicion, seemed clearer now, though not entirely free of tension. Villagers nodded to one another with exaggerated cheerfulness, as though determined to prove that life was quite normal again. Yet beneath the polite greetings and Sunday smiles lay the shadow of what had been revealed. For gossip did not die with the capture of the culprit. If anything, it redoubled. The Women's Institute discussed in detail the manner of Miss Carter's death, while Mrs. Bantry recounted her near escape at least half a dozen times a day. She took to calling herself, with a mixture of pride and shuddering horror, the second intended victim. Mrs. Price Ridley, meanwhile, insisted she had suspected Topham from the beginning, though in truth she had been the loudest in condemning Miss Dawes. The schoolmistress herself walked through the village with her head lifted once more, though the strain of those weeks had left her thinner, paler. Miss Marple observed her with quiet sympathy. A false accusation, she knew, left deeper wounds than most realized. Yet Miss Dawes, she suspected, would recover in time. Teaching gave her a sense of order and purpose, and she would cling to it all the more firmly now. Inspector Craddock stayed on in the village long enough to ensure the case was securely tied. He was not a man to indulge in speculation, yet even he admitted to Miss Marple that her insight had been the turning point. "I should have seen it," he confessed one evening at the vicarage. The cup, the second attempt, the fear it all pointed to Topham, but I let myself be distracted by the villagers' chatter. You cut through it like a knife. Miss Marple only smiled. It is not a matter of cleverness, Inspector, but of observation. One sees patterns. A governess watches children, their fibs and tantrums. A village spinster watches her neighbors. Human nature does not change, only the setting. Craddock gave her a look of reluctant admiration. "You're wasted on your roses and knitting, Miss Marple. Scotland Yard could do with you." But she shook her head, amused. "Oh no, Inspector. I should find London exhausting. Too much smoke, too many people in a hurry. Here, one has time to notice the little things, and it is the little things that matter." By the following Sunday, the village church was as full as ever. The hymns rang out, voices strong with a kind of defiance, as though to drown the memory of poison and betrayal. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed pew, listening quietly, her eyes drifting over the congregation. She saw relief, yes, but also something else, an unease that lingered still. For though the murderer had been found, the knowledge that such a thing had happened in their midst could not be easily forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Little Brimley returned to its rhythms. Children played on the green, housewives exchanged recipes, the vicar held his autumn meetings. Yet, every so often, Miss Carter's name would surface again, spoken in hushed tones, with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Some wondered what exactly she had known, what those burned letters had contained. No one could say for certain. Perhaps, as Miss Marple often reflected, their contents mattered less than the fact of their destruction. Secrets once suspected are as powerful as secrets proven. Topham was taken away to face justice, his London debts and shady dealings brought to light by the press. In the village, his name became a cautionary tale. Parents whispered of him to their children as a warning against dishonesty. Neighbors tutted over his fall from grace. Yet Miss Marple, in her quiet heart, felt a pang of sorrow. He had not been an evil man in the sense of malice. Rather, he had been weak, afraid, consumed by the terror of exposure. And weakness, she knew, could drive a person to dreadful acts. One evening, sitting by her hearth with her knitting in her lap, she thought again of Miss Carter. The governess had not been beloved, nor even particularly liked. But she had deserved better than to die alone upon the grass at a village fete. Lonely people, Miss Marple knew, often became the repositories of other people's truths, half-heard conversations, and accidental confidences. Miss Carter had held too many such truths, and she had paid the price. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and Miss Marple sighed softly. She thought of all the cases she had known, all the tragedies spun from ordinary lives. It always comes back to the same thing as human nature. The desire to conceal, the fear of shame, the pride that could not bear exposure. Murder, in her experience, was rarely grand. It was born of small, pitiful motives dressed in desperate action. And yet life continued. The roses still bloomed, the Women's Institute still met, and the children still sang their hymns on Sunday. The shadow of the crime would fade in time, as shadows always did, leaving behind only the faint reminder that evil could be as close as the neighbor across the hedge. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles again, the soft clack-clack filling the cozy room. She was content, for the village would sleep easier now, and the truth had been laid bare. Still her eyes held that familiar twinkle of sadness and wisdom. She knew that somewhere, in some other quiet corner of England, another crime was already ripening in the soil of human folly. And when it came, she would be ready as always to notice the overlooked, to untangle the threads and to remind the world that even in the most peaceful places, darkness was never far away.